Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's AAC Talks. We are very pleased to welcome William and Tony Evanko, or Tony, who is an artist, architect, and founder of Foundation Casa Tres Patios in Medellín, Colombia. Since 2006, Tony has been committed to using art, education, and collaborative practice as tools for social transformation, fostering critical thinking and civic engagement across diverse communities. In today's talk, prioritizing the present to change the future invites us to look closely at the evolution of Casa Tres Patios from a contemporary art center with international visibility to a socially oriented organization rooted in community led processes. Tony will share the project's decisions and everyday practices that shape this transition and the questions it continues to raise about the role of art in building more equitable futures. Tony, thank you so much for being here with us. The floor is all yours.
Mhm. Thanks, Maz, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really pleased to be here and pleased to know that there's some people that are interested in our history. But basically, what I'm going to do is try to summarize our history. We started in 2006 informally, and as a part of the process, you can sort of see how we evolved and the events that sort of shaped our history. And then at the end, if anybody has any questions or wants to talk about anything specifically, we can definitely do that too. As I mentioned, we started in Casa Tres Patios in 2006. And we started Casa Tres Patios as a result of experience that I had while I was on a Fulbright grant in Medellin. I won't go into the full history, but I'd been traveling to Medellin since 2001, first to show my own artwork in the University Museum here, and then to do workshops and a series of visits afterwards. And I was sort of looking for a way to leave the United States for a while and see what it was like to live in other countries. And so I applied for a Fulbright grant and got a Fulbright grant to come to Medellin. And as a part of the application process, as you might know, you have to get letters of invitation to make your grant stronger if you get letters of invitation. So a friend of mine in the National University gave me a letter of invitation, but with the condition that I help him with a class in the university while he takes a sabbatical. So I decided that that was fine, and the class is really not a class, but more of a presentation platform for the students to present their work basically 3 times in the semester. And so I would review the students' work and give them feedback and have to grade them as well. And the building where the art department is housed in the National University here in Medellin is this postmodern building, 3 stories with made of concrete block, no painted walls in any place almost. And the students had to use the central atrium space basically as a place where they would show their work. And it sort of worked okay for people who were doing 2-dimensional work, but it was still not really a good space for doing exhibitions or any kind of really utilizing the space in any kind of a meaningful way. So I really felt sort of like they were at a disadvantage in that respect. So I was thinking about this, and as the Fulbright grant pays you a lot of money for the housing expenses, at least at that time they did, and so I decided that it was what I could do is rent a big house in Medellin and basically paint it white and turn into a white space, a white cube space, and create a space where I would emphasize experimentation. And the experimentation, because as I was talking to the students about their processes, I realized that the students were basically just preparing sort of in a productive mode to from one presentation to the next, and weren't really looking at alternative media. They were sort of in the middle of their academic career, and I thought it was sort of strange that they didn't really have any real interest or understanding of how they could explore different avenues of expression in the development of their work and their proposals. So I basically rented a house in the center of the city, and this is the first house. And this in this house, what we decided to do was to convert the house into an experimental space where we would give each artist a space to work in for a month, and they could do whatever they wanted to. In some of my prior visits, I had the opportunity to work with students in the museum spaces here in town and in other institutions, and often they were really restricted in terms of what they could do in the space. They couldn't in the museum, for example, where we they couldn't hang things from the ceiling. They couldn't where they could hang things from the ceiling, but they couldn't perforate the ceiling. They couldn't put nails in the walls, and really a really restrictive kind of a situation. And those classes were, or those workshops were also about experimentation and giving them an opportunity to expand their artistic practice and experience. And so when I had this opportunity to rent this house, we basically told the artists and the students, you can do anything you want in the space. The only condition was that you have to bring the space, restore the space to the way that it was. And so we started inviting artists, groups of artists, to exhibit in the space and to do their work for a month and to try to use the space to their best advantage. And so the first group of students that we showed were actually a group of students that we were working with in the botanical garden here. Myself and another artist professor from the University of Antioquia, and we were basically doing work in the natural landscape, so to speak. Although the botanical garden is far from a real natural landscape, but the students were doing work with natural materials. Some of them were doing work with environmental concerns, things like that, pollution, so forth. And so when this house was ready to start using, we basically invited the students to come back to use the house, to use the opportunity to translate their installations in this natural setting to an exhibition space to kind of expand this educational process. And so these are some examples of things that they did with the natural materials that they brought into the space. They were given total freedom to do whatever they wanted to in the space. Many of them chose to just transport the materials from the botanical garden to the house. So they did things like they would used a lot of natural materials, sort of Andy Goldsworthy type experiences and experiences with using native or indigenous kind of patterns in relationship to the natural materials. And then the second group of artists, because these were the first group were students, and the second group were more established artists, and they were also given the freedom to do whatever they wanted to. And so in the first group of more professional artists, one artist who was actually the co-founder of Casa Tres Patios, Santiago Vélez, was working with water at the time, so he decided to waterproof the floor of and the walls of the living room space and put furniture in it. And so he took advantage of the freedom that he had to do that. Another artist, Juan Guillermo Caicedo, lit fires under these chairs and then cleared out the space, and so he was taking advantage of the space as well. So we had those kinds of experiences. Local graffiti artist, professor as well, wanted to paint a bus, almost a full-size bus in the patio space. This was Juan Fernando Velez. And then another took advantage of this is Juan Pablo Gomez, did this kind of installation in another space. And a young woman, a student, did a piece in which he hung this dress and painted the wall to sort of explore concepts around infancy and adolescence in the space too. So that's what we did for the first 6 months, basically, when I was on the grant. And during the second group of artists, when Juan Fernando Villas, the artist that painted the bus, in the opening, Juan Fernando told me that we were doing something really special in Casa Tres Patios and in Medellin, and I knew that there were other art spaces in Medellin, and so I was kind of puzzled by what Juan Fernando said, and I said, well, what is it, the experimental aspect, or is it, or what do you think is the most important aspect of what we're doing? And he said, no, it's not the experimental sort of educational aspect. What it is you don't have any limits on which group of artists to invite, because the experience, at least in Medellin, is that if you went to the University Nacional, then you would hang out with those artists that you studied with, or at the University of Antioquia, you would hang out with those artists, and basically would your knowledge of what the other artists were doing was very limited, mostly to opportunities that they would have in a museum space where they would openly invite any artist to participate in exhibitions and so forth. But that would only happen maybe once a year or something like that. So what Juan Fernando told me was that you were creating the social space every month, which was really important to the arts community. And so I thought that was really interesting. And it really sort of lit a fire in me to try to continue the space. But when the grant ran out, of course, I went back to the United States, but with I had met my current wife, and wanted to come back as well as continue the space. And so we we were trying to figure out what to do. So the Museum of Antioquia at that time was planning to revive the concept of the Bienal in Medellin, and which had been an important event in Latin America up until more or less 1981, when the violence in the city became so great that they decided they couldn't continue the process anymore. So the museum was contemplating sort of a revival of that kind of tradition, but without the commitment of the two-year cycle because of the financing situation. So they just started off with what they called an international meeting of artists, and they were planning it for 2007. So in 2006, at the end of 2006, a friend of mine who I had met in previous journeys invited me to come back to Medellin and to continue the process, but now with the artist residency component. And they said that if I wanted to come back, then they could support the foundation or the space, basically, at that time with funding for the residencies, and we would be asked to do activities, of course, in the space as well, exhibitions and public talks and things like that. And so that was the push that I needed to go forward and to continue the space. So in the end of 2006, I came back, and we spent about a month or two organizing the space. And then we started working with the artists in the space doing residencies. So we did different kinds of residencies with artists, curators, and architects. And this was a project that Adriano Ramirez did around the idea of a co-construction of a communal dinner with people who have different political and religious views. And she would just basically create conversations among people who would normally not associate with one another. Different other exhibitions involving technology. Camilo Restrepo had been working with the idea of drugs, and he continues to work with that concept. And he wanted to do. He's also trained as a mechanical engineer, so he wanted to try to do these kinds of installations to sort of vary from the projects that he had been doing, which were more photographically oriented. Then we did public talks. Sue Thomason is a Dutch artist that came with as a part of an invitation with another local artist group called El Puente Lab. So this is her public talk and sort of a glimpse of the exhibition that she did. As time went on, we started doing more work with residencies, but we also began to realize that we were sort of abandoning the local artist community. So we converted one of the spaces in the house into what we call them cuboekis, which is a sort of experimental white cube space. But it was a space that we invited local artists to do that same sort of dynamic of occupying the space as a working space for a month, in order to expand their horizons about looking at what they're interested in doing, but also just using the space as a way to develop new ideas. And we would invite the public into the space every couple of weeks to sort of check in on the artist and see what it was doing. It was sort of an opportunity to involve the local community, non-artistic community, into seeing the artist process and sort of demystifying process as well for the non-artistic community, but also for the younger artists to be able to see some of the more experienced artists developing their work and asking questions and developing experiments that were obviously not finished, and sort of change the role of the young artists with their former professors or the people that they looked up to in the community. And so we did other kinds of residencies. This was Anya Liftig doing a performance, and she did workshops with the local universities, students, collectives that were involved in performance art. Andrea Gardner from New Zealand was a photographer, and she did this. She has this process in which she creates these kind of surreal or possible landscapes, and she did a workshop for the local artists here, the local photographers. And this is a good place to sort of explain that when we were doing the residencies, almost always the residencies were accompanied by some sort of an exhibition and a public talk. That was sort of the minimum. But what we noticed was that when we would invite the national or the artists from Colombia, but not from Medellin, to do residencies, or international artists, we always focused on artists whose work we thought was a bit different from the practices that we would see in the city. Since we were connected with the universities, we had sort of a handle on what artists were doing generally, and our goal was to sort of continue this expansion of experience with the local artists to include practices or techniques that they hadn't really experienced before or seen directly. So some of the artists did these were in for their own initiative, by their own initiative, what they suggested dinners, communal dinners, or like Adriana, or others like Andrea did workshops with the local photographers, and those experiences worked really well. But when the artists came without that kind of a proposal to involve the local community, the experiences were often really awkward. I mean, we would do an exhibition of the artist's work or work that they brought with them from other artists in their country or community, and the public really didn't respond at all. Medellin tends to be a very kind of ethnocentric community. They're very proud of their own people and their own community, but they're not very interested in what's going on outside of Medellin, at least in the arts community. And so there was often, 6 of us in an opening on opening night, and because none of the local artists were involved in the process, basically nobody came. And that happened in public talks, it happened in exhibitions, and it didn't happen that often, but when it did happen, it was really an awful experience for us and for the artist. And so we decided we would start obligating the artists to do some sort of a workshop or some sort of an activity that would involve a number of local people, so that when we would do the public talks or the openings, that there would be at least somebody to sort of support the artist and make our work worthwhile, essentially. So we started doing that, and we invited Anna Terry and Don Hunter to come from New Zealand, and they did a workshop with children in the space, but they also did one of these exhibitions that not very many people came to. And so, but these kinds of projects then led us to this opportunity in 2012, at which time in the city there was this sort of power vacuum that had occurred because the government had rounded up all of the paramilitary leaders and extradited them to the United States. And so the gang members in the city began to list their own territories. And in 2012, this came to sort of a head, at which time the young gang members were sort of feeling jealous because the local rappers, who are often social rappers, had become sort of icons in their communities and neighborhoods. And the gang members it was sort of a adolescent jealousies, and so they began to threaten them, and in a few cases they killed them, and they began to displace them to other neighborhoods. And so in 2012, when the new administration, the new mayor came into office, his Secretary of Culture was really worried about this situation. And so she took a project that had been originally started in 2007. It was called the Network of Visual Arts. And she wanted to see if there was a way that she could convert this project, which had been a project in which local artists would be hired to give workshops based on their own practice, painting, drawing, photography, performance, and to try to convert that project into a project in which art would be used as a way to create a sense of citizenship, a sense of relevance for this young people in terms of their relationship with the community, and in sort of an effort to try to give them an alternative so they wouldn't join in the criminal activities or be threatened by the gangs. And so the Secretary of Culture had gone to the universities who had run the project in the past, and the universities didn't really, sort of paradoxically, the universities weren't interested in changing their methodology to try to develop some sort of a methodology that would be able to be more structured toward this kind of end. And so based on our history of doing these kind of workshops that were a little out of the ordinary, and what we were doing them with a lot of, we were doing frequently, the Secretary of Culture came to us and asked us if we would do a pilot project. And so since we liked experiments, we decided, yeah, sure, we'll try it. But, without, she had to know that we really didn't have any experience, pedagogical experience, or really any way of thinking about it more beyond just art education, traditional art education. So anyway, she gave us the opportunity, and we started to do the project in 2012. And we ended up operating the project from 2012 to 2018. And during that time, we began to really take seriously this kind of task of figuring out what kinds of projects we could do with the young people in order to create the sort of sense of interest and relevancy for them as relates to the city. So we started working on the project, and we did start to develop a methodology that we feel like is a relevant methodology, but it's related in many ways to the artistic process itself, or the creative process itself. So we also did projects like this project. It's an ongoing project where we use the word berraco, which is a sort of misspelling of the word berraco that means a male pig or a hog in Spanish, but also has this connotation in many places of being a macho kind of person, a strong, determined person, but also has this kind of very masculine, even dominating kind of connotation that we wanted to try. I was curious about this ever since I heard the word, and we wanted to try to see if we could re-signify the word. So we began to put up these posters all over the city about 3 or 4 times a year. They would have slogans like this one that says, "Un berraco doesn't mistreat children." We did the same thing for the berraco doesn't mistreat women. Berraco carries the groceries, goes shopping, and there's a lot of different lets the people into the line, or those kinds of things that are sort of more common kind of activities that are normally associated or not necessarily associated with being a strong macho figure. So we did this kind of a project, and it's an ongoing project that we continue to do every year, 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, depending on our budget. So we did other workshop. We did a workshop with these people who are agents in the public spaces. They're the ones that are in charge of monitoring the use of the public space, and that often includes informal vendors. And so we did they had this kind of reputation of being brusque and not very empathetic to the people in the public space. So we did these sensitivity workshops for them. And we did a project with the University of Edinburgh, a re-socialization project with young people in Chocó. We did this in collaboration with a musical group from Cali and the university. We also did this project with this migration project with unit with the Museum of Memory here in Medellin, and because this is sort of the height of the migration from Venezuela. So we did a workshop with this group of migrants or immigrants that were from different countries, not just Venezuela, Mexico and Argentina, and I believe there was one person from Chile. And so we worked with them, and they basically created a community dinner where they compared different recipes, and as a result, the different experiences as a sort of way to break down the barriers, the cultural barriers between people from the city and people from different cultures. And in 2018, we did a project which was, well, in 2018, what we did was we ended the relationship with the Network of Visual Arts because of different philosophical approaches from the mayor's office began to dictate the composition of the team that we had to hire. And economically, there were changes, administrative changes that the local administration had to deal with that really made the project economically unfeasible for us. So, but in that particular time too, we were still at the sort of end of the transition. The peace process had been signed in 2000, finally signed in 2017. So there was still this kind of debate going on about whether the peace process was really going to work, and how the ex-combatants would be integrated into the society, and if that was working. And so there were lots of things happening in Colombia at the time. And so what we did was, at the end of the year, we had a team meeting, and we did sort of this brainstorming session in which everybody was given post-it notes. And then we asked the people in the meeting, which included administrators, but it also included artists and educators. And we asked them what was the most important thing, or what were the most important things that they felt like we needed to address or should be addressed. Not that we could do anything about it, but what should be addressed in the society in general, in the world, in the community. And it was interesting because when we looked at the notes included things like economic inequality, problems with the environmental concerns, gender issues, lack of quality education, lack of access to good health care, lots of issues that had extremely important, as we're seeing more and more, are becoming more even today. And what we realized is that nobody mentioned art. It was incredible, because here we were after 15 years or so of, almost 15 years of experience. Nobody mentioned art, and it was really kind of a turning point for us. We decided that since there were other alternative spaces at that time in Medellin, that maybe our role, given this history of these workshops and working with different communities and different social groups, maybe that's really the direction that we should be taking. And we had really focused on developing at least a starting point of a methodology. And so we decided to change the mission of the foundation to a mission that includes the word social justice through pedagogy, artistic practice, and research. And so we began to try to integrate that kind of direction, but maintaining the residencies to a certain extent, but now focusing more on residencies that were dealing with issues to do with the community, but also issues to do with the reintegration process of the ex-combatants. And so we would work with groups like this group, the Ribbon Collective from France, who work with technology. And we worked with the artist from Argentina, Ivo Eichenbaum, who was doing a series of documentaries in countries that had experienced violence and were now coming out of in this peace process. And he worked with a group of ex-combatants. He wanted to work with a group of ex-combatants in Santa Lucia. In one of these reintegration camps, in this case, it was a reintegration camp Roman Ruiz in Santa Lucia, which is a very remote area, relatively close to Medellin, about 4 or 5 hours away from Medellin in the mountains. Ivo had an interesting experience. He wanted to give these workshops, or he wanted to do his video, but he also, we insisted that he try to give community something in return. And he was going to do a series of workshops to help them understand how to how to use their audiovisual equipment to create their own videos and so forth, to promote their productive projects that were part of the requirement of the peace process. But when he got to the camp, he realized that the participants had very little free time to attend workshops. And so our plans didn't work very well. So he had made friends with a young man who was an ex-combatant, but also ran the store in the camp, and realized that John, the ex-combatant, had taken a series of photographs during his time with the in active duty, let's say, with the FARC. And he had photographically recorded the last day where the FARC had turned in their weapons, and talking about his companions in the FARC, and not only their this process of reintegration or their fears, but these personal experiences that he experienced with them, and their characters and so forth, and his relationship with in his sort of feelings about this transition, and what he was hoping for. And so they did a video using John's photographs, with John narrating the transition. It's called The Last March, and it's by Ivo Achenbaum. You can find it on YouTube, I believe. Anyway, as a part of that process, working with the ex-combatants of the FARC, we also did an exhibition in which we included work from other organizations that do work with reintegration of different organizations using different techniques, artistic techniques, as well as others. And we had an opportunity to work with a group of artists who came from the United States, but also a French artist, Amélie Cabosal, Erica Thomas, and Roger Peter from the United States, from Portland, Oregon. And we worked with Alvaro Botero, who is a young artist here in Medellín, who has a graphic arts collective, specifically silkscreen printing. But we had been invited to do this workshop by people who were in the communications team of the FARC, because the FARC had a tendency of creating these slogans that were diatribes, or long, difficult to understand slogans. And so what they wanted to do was to try to figure out a way, they wanted to try to learn how to consolidate a slogan into a few words so that they could put it on T-shirts or distribute it more broadly, and it could be more easily understood by the general public, and not so politically sort of charged and extensive. So we worked with this group of communications team in the FARC in this particular reintegration camp in Carrizal. So this is the area, the place where they did it. It was a community center within the camp, seen from the workshop. And what we did basically was to take materials that they had on hand, a boot and a flower, and be able to figure out how they could use photography to essentially convert it into a silkscreen print that they could then publish and distribute. So it's more opinions, less deaths. That we hope that our dreams don't kill us, basically. And so that was the process that we did with them, and it was really a successful workshop. And as it turns out, what we learned was that the ex-combatants of the FARC needed to propose to the government productive projects, and most of their projects, or in many cases their projects, had to do with cultivating the land. But some of them were interested in doing other things. And one of the residency camps, or the reintegration camps, sorry, there were people who learned how to sew, and they would create backpack services for their community as well. So the idea of teaching graphic design and silkscreen printing was a practical kind of experience that they could also use to start businesses, small businesses, informal businesses that in order to. In any case, we worked with the LGBT plus community, because it's in Medellin, the tolerance for, or the acceptance, I should say, for the LGBT community is really low. There's still very strongly discriminated against. And they have some areas of town where they just can't go. And so we tried to do a mapping project with them to try to determine which areas were safe, which areas they felt were dangerous, and so forth. And it was from a group, a collective, a trans collective called Antioquia Trans that we worked with in collaboration with the Divas Gallery. And so we did this project with the Network of Visual Arts, just to sort of summarize, and we had over 6,000 children in the course of the years that we worked with, basically the 7 years that we worked with the Network of Visual Arts. And we did publications both based on the experiences we did with the network, as well as other projects that we had done. The workshops that we did in general, we include about 2,000 participants from the artistic community, the art students, the general public, the institutional groups. And in 2019, I met a prison guard, an ex-prison guard, but also an artist, who had started a project in the prison in Itagüí, Antioquia, which is just a community just south of Medellín. And while he was working in the prison, he was studying art. He graduated with an undergraduate degree in art. And he wondered how he could use art as a way to kind of mediate or mitigate effects of being in the prison with the inmates. And so he convinced the director of the prison to let him use spaces in the prison which had been unused spaces and deteriorated. And he convinced the director that he could restore the spaces as well as convert them into sort of this gallery workspace kind of environment. And with a proposal that the inmates could spend time in these spaces learning to draw and paint and work together as an alternative to being forced to spend their time in what we call the patios, or in the United States they call them the yards, which tend to be environments that are tense, full of hierarchies, often violent. And so the director, that director, decided that was a good idea. So he let Carlos renovate the spaces, and for about a year and a half or 2 years, Carlos worked with the inmates in those spaces, and he began to see real changes in the behavior and the attitudes of the inmates just as a result of having this time away from this kind of tension in the yards. And the more experienced artists, inmates would instruct the less experienced inmates, and they would just have time to sort of reflect on whatever it was that was bothering them. And there were these transitions, or the transformations that happened in the relatively short period of time, were really remarkable. There were people that would come into the workshops initially on drugs and high, and in a week or 2 weeks they would leave the drugs and just come into the workshops just to be with the other inmates, and began to open up and talk about their experiences and their hopes and their fears, everything, just as a result of just having this time to relax, and this time to learn something that transported them away from their day-to-day experience in the prisons. And so when Carlos showed me the project, I said, this is a fantastic project. If we can do anything as a foundation to help you at some point, just don't hesitate to ask. And so we continued to talk over the course of 2019. And in 2020, the pandemic struck. And no, I should back up a little bit. In 2019, during our conversations, Carlos lost access to the place in Itagüí because the new director didn't like the project or didn't think it was necessary. So she closed the door on the project, and Carlos found a space in another prison called Bella Vista here in Medellin. And he did the same project in Bella Vista in 2019. This is a photograph of the inmates in the pink shirts and their family members who were let into the prison for the opening. And this was a way for Carlos and some volunteer artists to continue with the project. But in 2020, when the pandemic struck, the prisons, which are normally overcrowded anyway, needed to use all the available spaces that they had to quarantine prisoners that had been infected and so forth. And so the project, as it was designed in Bay Vista, had to be shut down. But Carlos, because of his experience with the institute that runs the prison system, was able to gain access into this prison, but also a prison that's called Pedregal on the outskirts of Medellin, in order to continue the project. But during the pandemic, we couldn't come in and go out with the kind of freedom that we had before. So Carlos came to us, and asked us if we had any ideas about how we could continue. And so together we came up with an idea of using analog processes and sketchbooks, sort of drawing kits for the inmates, accompanied by sheets of questions, essentially questions, but questions that were absurd questions that how can you fly squatting down, things like that are just absurd, sort of surreal questions that would maybe provoke their ideas about anything. They could answer the questions or just use it as sort of a point of departure or something like that. But the idea was to collect their work, their sketchbooks every month, and Carlos would go into the prison to collect their workshops every month, or their sketchbooks every month, and we would scan them essentially as a documentation process, and then return them to the prisoners, and they would continue to work. So we worked on that project in that way during the pandemic, and then afterwards we began to work with on the project with Carlos until 2023. And in 2022, we had an opportunity to show aspects of the project in the Museum of Modern Art as a part of an exhibition that was called Pulso de la Ciudad, or the Pulse of the City. And it was a project in which we asked the inmates to do posters, essentially. And we don't have any digital equipment in the prisons. So they did these analog posters that you might be able to see that there's some posters that have to do with the idea of the body, forgiveness, reconciliation, drugs. There was some that has to do with the environment, contamination. So the idea is that or what we realized was that the prisoners are complex people, and they have worries just like everybody else does. And so when the museum asked us to do this exhibition, that was what we tried to emphasize. So we emphasized they tried to rehumanize or the prisoners in the view of the public. And so we showed some of these are just a small sample of the posters that they created. They created over 100 posters, and on the monitor that you see there, there was a video that we did showing all 100 posters. This video shows sort of the process of Trazos de Libertad in general. And as a result of the project in 2023, the process in 2023, we came up with an idea of trying to stimulate reflections on the part of the inmates with respect to the decisions that they made during their lives, or the experiences that they had prior to their incarceration, and also to give them the opportunity to think about the opportunity, the invitation to think about what they hope for in the future. And so, with the pretext of the name Sueños, of dreams, we began to explore with them their dreams as children, their dreams as adolescents, and talk about the experiences that they had in those periods in their lives. And then at the end, they would produce sort of these mental maps of how they would what their dreams were, and the stages that they needed to go through, or the process that they needed to go through in order to realize their dreams. And so that project was really successful in 2023, and 2023 was also the year that Carlos decided that he wanted to go back to his own artistic practice, and he had created a foundation that was called or a corporation, I should say, nonprofit corporation, called Trazos de Libertad. And so when Carlos decided to leave the project, we didn't want to continue with the same name because that was Carlos's project. So we used the name of the pilot project that we had done about dreams as a way to start in 2024 with the project called Sueños, and so that became a core aspect of our methodology working with this group of prisoners. And so they produce different kinds of maps, and currently we have the exhibition up here in the house of the works that were produced at the end of 2024. So this is kind of some shots of the exhibitions. And the exhibitions, it's kind of paradoxical because we would try to do an exhibition within the prison for the inmates themselves, which is, as you can imagine, with the number of pieces that we have with every group in the art in the prison system. We only have an access. We don't have permanent spaces in the prison. We have to go in and we have to do the workshops every 2 hours that last at most 2 hours. And so it's difficult to mount an exhibition in the prison system, in the prison itself. But so what we decided to do was to ask the inmates if they would lend us their work and put the exhibition up here in the house, and then we would invite the families of the inmates to come and see the work that their family member had produced, and it was a nice gesture because the family is so important to most of them, if not all of them. And so they would see the word family and the representation of the family members on these maps. And so it was a way for them to give their families something. And then the families, in the exhibition, we would do sort of testimonials from the families and then share them again in the prison itself with the specific inmates and with their group of companions in the prison system. And we, as a result of the experience with the prisoners, we began to realize that part of their anxiety in general is what they're going to do in the future and how to make money, both in the prison system as well as out. And so we took the experience that we had with the communications team of the FARC, the silkscreen printing and graphic design, and began to got funding to do that same project within the prison system, but also outside of the prison system for ex inmates. Within the prison system, it worked pretty well because, of course, they were there and they needed to. In many cases, they wanted to attend the workshops. And just sort of as an aside, it's important to understand that the workshops in the prison systems, in any case, are used by this particular prison system to help the inmates reduce their time in the prison. So for every hour they spend in a workshop, they get a certain number of hours reduced off of their prison time. And so often these workshops are attended by people who are interested in drawing or free expression or participating, but most of the time the primary motivation is to reduce the time that they have to serve. And that's true not only for our workshops, but for all the workshops that are offered in the prison system. So that's just kind of an aside to understand sort of the challenges that these workshops represent with respect to motivating the participation and motivating the reflections that we hope to generate in the workshops. Anyway, so we started doing these workshops involving silkscreen printing and graphic design, and they're well attended because they can see the economic value of them. And we also started a project last year for adolescents, and it's based on the idea that a little later in the presentation, I'll talk about this, but the abilities that we're trying to foment in our methodology are related to the ability to ask questions, the ability to think critically, creatively, and in sort of an empathetic and compassive way. So we thought, what kind of a model would work with young people, and we decided that the idea of journalism or communications would work for the young people. And so as a way to get them to think about questions that they might ask based on their observation of their own environment or their own interests, and to be able to think critically about their own experiences. And so we created this agency that's called Las Chicharras, or the Cicadas advertising agency. And the idea is to to let the participants decide on whatever it is they want to try to express, and then to help them or accompany them in learning audiovisual techniques, graphic design, and those kinds of things. So that's the latest project that we have. And now this is the translation of our current mission statement. It's basically to foster agents of change capable of transforming their lives and society by cultivating critical thinking, the ability to question, and the creativity to build meaningful solutions. And so based on our experience with artists and in general, we began to sort of think about what kind of abilities do artists possess generally. And we came up with the three that were the most important initially, which was curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking. And so we began to sort of try to digest this into a methodology. And as we began to analyze these abilities, let's say, we begin our skills. We realize that curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking are also skills related to a great extent with this whole concept of innovation and product development and so forth. And we wanted to try to understand what other skills or characteristics are necessary. And so we added empathy and compassion into the mix so that we could use those as filters for determining whether or not solutions that we came up with, that the students come up with, the participants, I should say, come up with, or the inmates come up with, have these aspects of empathy and compassion, not only on a humanistic scale, but on an environmental scale as well. And so these are the five basic characteristics and abilities that we focus on in our methodology, working with these different groups. And of course, because of the characteristics of each group, we have to approach it in different ways. But these are this is the sort of the base of the methodology that we implement. And so this is another way of understanding it. The sensitivity that empathy and compassion generate, plus the curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking enable us to implement sensitive solutions to resolve the problems, conditions, and situations of ourselves, others, and the planet. And so that's it. That's where we are right now. We're in the process of formalizing the methodology into a document that we hope to publish. And this year in Casa Tres Patios is a transition year for us. I've been doing this since 2006, and so now we're going to open the door to a young woman who has been working with us off and on for a long time, very committed, and an artist as well as a curator, and very interested in education. And so she'll be taking over the next year, and I'll be working as an advisor.
Thank you so much, Tony. I mean, wow, that's it's an incredible journey of all this time. I wanted to ask you about on this matter of shifting the institutional priorities. So, as you also mentioned, and also had the pleasure of visiting Casa Tres Patios in Medellin when I was visiting Colombia. So, as you are in this phase of institutional transition, so Casa Tres Patios transitioned from a contemporary art center to a socially oriented organization. So what are the kind of like internal, maybe tension or resistance emerged perhaps during this shift, and both from within the team or from the broader art ecosystem of Medellin or Colombia? And how did you possibly navigated them?
Well, as I mentioned in the talk, when we were considering this change, we had mixed feelings, and we sort of still do. I mean, the idea, we all love art, we all love seeing art, and feel like the developing critical thinking and these skills in artists is really important as well. But we were torn because we saw, but living in this environment, you see these kinds of social and political and economic situations every day, and you begin to wonder about the accessibility of art. And I think we all struggle with that. People that work in museums and the development of public development of their public and all that kind of stuff is really one of the biggest challenges in the art world in general. And we had to sort of weigh essentially became an issue that was related very much to the energy that we have as a team. What do we have? What do we have the energy to do? Because we would do. We have some years where when we were doing residencies, we would have some. One year, I remember specifically, we counted the number of events that we did that year, and we did 63 events in one year between exhibitions, public talks, and so forth. And we all know how much work any of those events take. And so as a team of 5, 6, 7 people, it was really, really exhausting. And then we thought, no, we have to reduce the number of exhibitions. We have to reduce the number of residencies. It's just too much. And the next year we did more events. It was really absurd. And so, after all that experience and time, when we did this kind of brainstorming session in 2018, we just said, if we're going to do this, we have to do it well. And so we can't continue this rhythm that we have now. And we realized in 2018 there were more alternative art spaces available, and so the work that we were doing was sort of redundant in a certain way, because there were spaces that were more collectively oriented. In other words, there was sort of this core group of artists that did this work, and they would collaborate, and they had their friends, and they were local artists. And so the dynamic in those spaces was really beautiful, and it was working, and it was working fine. And so we thought, well, rather than try to devote so much energy to projects in which the public would come to the public talks, the public would come to the opening night of the exhibition, but they would never come back until the next. And so we would dedicate so much time to accompanying artists in their processes in the city and to developing these events that we were just burning out. And so we had to decide, based on this meeting that we had, what were our priorities, what's important to us as human beings, even and artists, and how can we continue to do this work to a certain extent involving art or artistic practices or concepts relating to art, and maintain a level of professionalism that we wanted to maintain, and do a deep dive into things, methodological theories, things like that. And so it was essentially a question of economics and energy that we had to confront. And so that was a big part of it. I mean, there are institutions, museums, and so forth that do incredible outreach programs with the community. The Museum of Antioquia is a really good example. But I mean, the number of staff that they have and the budgets that they have are much different than ours. And so in order to be able to focus ourselves, we did have to go through this process of prioritizing. And so that's what we ended up doing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was essentially the process. It was a really difficult process because we still struggle between this notion of art and potential that art has in these workshops. That's why when we do these projects with different communities, we try to maintain some aspect of expression, but also trying to become a little bit more serious about it, and not just focus on the technical aspects, but focus on aspects that inform artistic practices in general. I mean, the example with the adolescents, if we can foment these abilities in the adolescents, it's a way for us to stimulate creativity in a sense that doesn't necessarily result in works of art, but it results in people who are able to think of things in a different way. And that'll help them in the future also understand art in a little bit different way, but also understand the topics that they encounter in their academic careers and things like that in a different way as well. And so in a way, we had to shift our ideas about what we're creating as artists, and the participants really in a way become our works of art in a certain sense. I mean, that's what we sort of think about. is that
Mm.
that's really important, the impact that we make on them. And so our creative abilities are more focused on how we can generate dynamics in these different workshop scenarios in order to really generate people who are sincerely interested in being creative and who are sincerely interested in asking questions and passionate about that. And then what they do with those in their future may result in artists or may result in lawyers. I don't know, but But the idea is that they begin to see their abilities as human beings in a different way. So,
Thank you so much. Another question. Oftentimes, socially engaged work is often pressured to prove impact. So, how does Casa Tres Patios actually evaluate this and the long term effects without reproducing extractivist measurement tools per se, or imposing external definitions of success onto the community you work with? So, how do you navigate this process?
yeah, well, that's an interesting question too, because we we talked with different arts organizations about this kind of that question at the beginning, and there
Mm.
was, and also I have to say that even in the academic center, now I'm teaching. I'm also doing a class in the art education department, or the section of the Faculty of Arts that does art education.
Mhm.
And that's a really it's an interesting subject because but part of it is the idea of, let's just take the example of doing reports for a funder. I always had and maybe this comes from my architectural background, I don't know, but the idea that doing a report has to sound, or it has to be extractive.
Mm.
I think that maybe it's the question is not that, it's like, what's the purpose of doing a report? And the purpose
Mm.
is not to extract. The purpose is to understand if what we're doing is valuable. And so, because that's always been our philosophy when we did the network of visual arts. I mean, they always wanted a report, but what we wanted to do was to analyze our process and to see if what we were doing really was valuable, and what were the problems, what were the obstacles, what did we do well, what did we do poorly, what were the problems in communication between the institution, let's say the Secretary of Culture and the institution, our institution. And it wasn't because we had to do it; it was because we wanted to do it. We wanted to evaluate our own performance, basically, and we can
Mm.
only do that through understanding if we are leaving some kind of skill or something concrete with the people with whom we work. And so that's always been our kind of philosophy, is that we're not doing it because we have to do it, we're doing it because we need to do it. We need to do it as an organization in order to see if what we're really doing is working. That's why when we decided to begin to obligate the artists and residents to
Mm.
do workshops, it was because we weren't, if we just give the artist, the national artist or the international artist, a chance to show their work and nobody comes, I mean, then we're not doing anything. We're just, and the
Mm.
artist feels horrible. And so I mean, it was kind of that same reflection, is that if we really want people to come and to benefit from the presence of these artists and residents, we need to involve in this community,
Mm.
because this community is really sort of insular, and there's not a lot of curiosity, as I mentioned, about what's going on around it. So in this
Mhm.
community, it was essential, in order to leave some sort of an impact on the community, we had to change our methodology to obligate the artists to involve the community in a certain way, so that their
Mm.
friends and their fellow artists would come to the events to be able to learn something from it, even if they didn't do the opening.
Mhm.
And so we've always kind of thought about those processes not as extractive processes, but processes that we need to do in order to understand it from our perspective, in order to make it better, in order to make whatever comes out of the process better. And the benchmark is not whether we're creating good art. The benchmark for us is whether we're leaving concrete abilities in the participants.
Mm.
The art aspect of it. I mean, there's some people in these posters that we have in our space. There's some that are really incredible. I mean, just the graphic
Mhm.
qualities, and they're incredible. Other ones not, and that's no normal. I mean, even in the art schools,
Mhm.
that happens. So so it's. I think that's what I would say is the response. We try to do the evaluation processes in ways that are more qualitative,
Mhm.
based on our observations and working with the people, with the participants. We try to figure out a way without getting them to fill out forms and things like that, which in many of these situations it's virtually impossible anyway. In the prison system, for example, the illiteracy rate or the literacy rate is very low. Is low. I mean, it's, I would say you could almost think about. I think it's approximately in our classes, in our groups, they're 30 to 40% don't read and write. And so it's absurd to think of that they would be able to fill out some kind of a form or something like that. So we try to
Mhm.
use the experience that we have in dealing with them directly and
Mhm.
seeing and observing their the work that they produce to understand how how able they are, for example, to project the steps that they need to go through in order to achieve their goal. Because often, what we see in these works is that they identify this ideal life, and they identify things that are important to them in their life, like their family, their religion, maybe freedom, things like that. But they don't have this understanding of how to plan to their future. So sometimes they mention education or things like that, but in many cases, no. And so
Mhm.
that gives us a way to use this kind of process as a way to observe what we could help them understand a little bit more, or to sort of at least signal that they, if you want to start a business, then what do you need to know to be able to start that business? And just ask them questions, and so they begin to understand it. And then in the next phase of their dream, they're able to more clearly identify it. And so we try to do it in a way that's more organic of the workshop.
Mm. Thank you. Very curious about quote unquote mistakes. I think mistakes are oftentimes wisdom in disguise. So, in this journey of Casa Tres Patios, which is an incredible journey, and all the shifts that you have gone through, is there any mistake that you made that you were proud of?
um, I don't know. There's a mistake that we made that we're not proud of, but it's really an important one,
Uh-huh.
which was to just start off with absolutely no knowledge at all about how to run any kind of an organization other than a business. I had several experiences running businesses, but this sort of, maybe it's sort of a mix of both being proud of it and being something that I sort of regret in a way. But when we first started out, we had no idea, not a clue about how to raise funding, not a clue. But even worse, when we started off, we didn't really even consider the dynamics, or the how an organization that's well structured can really evolve into an organization that's much more powerful. And the best example is the idea of creating a board of directors and the importance of a board of directors. We had no idea. We thought we'll get a bunch of our friends, artists, academics together, and they can become the board of directors. That was not a good idea. That was it was not a good idea, because they trusted us, and they trusted us to make all the decisions, and they weren't really, they were interested but not that interested, but they served the purpose as a board of directors and
Mm.
legally. And that was a mistake. That was a big mistake. And we've had the opportunity to advise other groups that want to sort of formalize themselves, and I always tell
Mm.
them, try to find people who are going to really support you in your efforts as a board of
Mm.
director, with ideas, with contacts, with money, whatever. But that was a fundamental mistake that I think, in a way, could have been part of the reason that we ended up exhausting ourselves to such an extent
Yeah.
initially. I mean, the first 4 years we worked without salaries, for 4 years straight, and we worked without salaries, and we just kept doing it because of the passion of doing it, but
Mm,
we had no idea how to really structure ourselves as an organization. We were working as an organization, but functioning collective, and it was really not a good situation. Um,
mm,
I think I think that the rest of the process has been a fairly logical process, but it's also been a process of constant reflection and sort of what you were mentioning as mistakes. I think that the mistake that we made, maybe of overextending ourselves in the number of events that we did, was a mistake that turned out to be the impulse that we needed to make the change to
mm,
becoming more socially oriented.
mm,
Um, we weren't naive. We realized, when we evaluate our financial structure, we realized that funding for cultural projects had been going down because we participated in the same proposal process for the Secretary of Culture, the Ministry of Culture, et cetera. We got grants for doing residencies, and the competition grew as well as the funding. I think true
mm,
all over the world.
mhm,
But we realized also we were looking at our education projects, or what we call sort of informal education projects, as a way of trying to navigate toward those kinds of funding sources as well. So we realized we saw the number of projects that were supporting projects for youth, disadvantaged communities, things like that. And it was not a we weren't naive when we made the decision about social transitioning into social
mm,
practice. And
mhm.
so, of course, that became a factor as well. But it wasn't
Yeah.
the primary factor. The primary factor was our own personal priorities.
Mm. Yeah, I remember in our conversation we were talking about that the socially engaged practices or process-based projects or yeah, community-oriented projects. They sounds very, yeah, I mean, very warm and very welcoming. But to create this warmth and this sense of, or the notion of someone like all the others who participates to make them feel welcome, that's a lot of work, and that those hours or those intentions are not necessarily like counted in the budgets or in the salaries that when we are like we are receiving from while doing that. So what you say that overextending ourselves, I think this is, yeah, a very common scenario for a lot of institutions who are also, yeah, are doing incredible work, but going through, I mean, overextension feels like a norm, unfortunately. But yeah, I don't know what is the other ways around to that. But well, yeah. But thank you so much for sharing your journey with us, Tony. Really, really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you everyone also for staying with us, Tony. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you and have a lovely rest of the day, wherever you are. For Tony, it's the morning. For me, it's 9:30 p.m. I'm in Bangladesh right now, and in Berlin, I believe it's 3, no, 4, I think. 4:30, I guess. So enjoy your time and see you all soon. Take care. Bye bye.